This is the Movie Theater Butter Podcast, where we talk about stories made into movies and what was modified for the big screen. As a warning, this episode will discuss the plot of both the movie and its original source material, so be ready for spoilers. I'm your host, Kim Labick, and I hope you enjoy the show. So, in case you haven't read the episode title, today we're talking about that bomb movie. Not that one, and not the other one you're thinking about either. This is a new bomb movie called Oppenheimer. Or, you know what? I should ask you this right now. Is it Oppenheimer? They said that in the movie, and I just totally glossed over it.
My understanding is it's Oppenheimer.
Okay, so we're going to call it Oppenheimer for the rest of everything. And if we're wrong, fuck it. Who cares?
Yeah, you can just turn off the episode now.
Yeah, let's just, if you don't like us, if you don't like the way that we pronounce the word Oppenheimer, you can just leave, I guess. But don't, maybe. Keep listening. Thank you so much. So anyways, Oppenheimer is obviously based off the life of J. Robert Oppenheimer, but it's more directly based off the 2005 biography titled American Prometheus, the Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, there's almost as many words in that as the people who actually died from the atomic bombings. But anyways, this is a serious issue. We have a lot to get through on this topic today, so I would like to bring in officially our guest, my good friend and political expert, Luke Dzwonkowski.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me, Kim. Very excited to be here.
Anytime. So this is unofficially our fourth podcast together, I think?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I can't remember now.
Yeah, and there's a whole episode totally unreleased that I've just never edited because I think that was the Silence of the Lambs one.
Yeah.
That we went on for like 3.5 hours.
Oh yeah, we've got one in the tank. We started strong with Sleepy Hollow. Did we do... What else did we do? Oh boy.
Maybe it was just Silence of the Lambs. Maybe it was just Sleepy Hollow, Silence of the Lambs.
Jurassic Park.
Oh.
Yes,
yep.
Of course.
That's a good one. All right. So as we always do, we kind of try and start off with, I gave you like a quick sentence of history. We'll get into a lot more of that later. But we also like to start off with a favorite quote. Luke, did you come with a favorite quote today?
I did. So my favorite quote from the film is, "I don't wish the culmination of 3 centuries of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction," which to me was powerful and thematically resonates so strongly. And it comes at sort of a crucial point in the film when the Manhattan Project is just getting off the ground and he's recruiting all of these talented individuals.
Solid. I'm glad that you didn't come with the whole "now I am become death." And I didn't expect you to, because you're a lot more like original than that. You're not going to come with just the most classic thing. But just to also give you a compliment on top of what was like a weird backhanded not compliment. Thank you for not coming with that specific quote.
And thank you for saying that, because...
that's just because that quote bothers me.
Yeah, so that was my quote for like a year and a half. No, that's too long. That was my quote because it's like so powerful and it's like, gosh, it's so poetic. But it's also sort of a misappropriation of like, what it comes from. And to be used in this context, I think was upsetting to people who find the Bhagavad Gita, the text that it comes from, to be like a powerful source of emotional fulfillment or something. But anyway, what's your quote?
So it's a couple of words, but the quote, they said it a couple times about theory will only get you so far. That one really stuck with me. And I know there's a lot of other like more in-depth deep ones, but for some reason that really stuck with me. And I think particularly to contextualize it, like with your and my friendship, you studied political theory in college and we talked a lot about, philosophy and a lot of sort of theoretical stuff, which is just fun to talk about and a great way to sort of like get your brain going. But there are always times where we would get to a point in the conversation where, theory will only get you so far. We would get to a moment where one or both of us would be like, yeah, we can think that X sort of government plan is a great idea and maybe it's got all of this, behind it that says that this is going to help people and be a beneficial thing. But in practice, it's a totally different story. I think we also talk about that sometimes with technology. When you called me, that's the first time I learned that word, by the way, Luddite. When you were like, yeah, you're just being kind of a Luddite.
Oh, yeah.
I would take that back to this kind of quote about theory will only get you so far, because especially stuff like new technologies, there's a lot of like, yes, this thing can be so cool and wow, aren't we excited for it to be here now? Isn't this amazing? But at the end of the day, the implementation of that technology could be so much different than your hopes and dreams for it, if that makes sense.
Totally. And I think that line is used in response to the near zero possibility that they would light the entire atmosphere on fire and just kill all life on Earth, right?
Oh, God. That I think was like one of the more powerful parts of the film, because it being a historical film, we know the ending in a sense, right? Like, we know, obviously, this didn't blow up the world. We're here today watching a movie about this. But I do think that whole point that he tried to make was very powerful, because I don't know about you, I felt that anxiety, right? I felt that anxiety of like, oh my God, what if it did? What if it would? Like that, it's scary.
Yeah.
A giant fucking bomb is scary, people.
Which is true, by the way. I mean, that they didn't know for like a certainty that it wouldn't cause this infinite chain reaction. However, the book does sort of spell out that they dismissed that idea as being like pretty extreme, pretty the chance of it happening is like so absurdly small that it wasn't really worth being worried about. So when they kind of harp on it in the film, like they use that line, I think 3 times throughout the film, or like they talk about that idea multiple times. And then I was kind of wondering, okay, well, if you read the book, you know that possibility was pretty low. So they're really focusing on that. And I thought, maybe that's too much of a stretch. And then the last line of the film, when he brings it around and he says, we talked about how we might cause a chain reaction that destroys the world. I think we did. And I realized that Nolan was using it now as like a metaphorical device for political ramifications of having created this bomb. When that line was delivered, I went, oh, I see now why Nolan has been focused so much on this line. Not only is it a wild thing to even just think about, but that's actually what happened. Just not the bomb itself, but the people who are in control of the bomb caused this kind of chaotic chain reaction of power and geopolitics.
Yes. To your point, absolutely. I do want to say that reveal, that moment of like, oh, that's what he said, that was the big epic kind of changing point, reminded me a lot of the movie There Will Be Blood, just in the sense that both of these movies are kind of a slow burn in some ways, and the ending really fucking brings it on, really makes it heavy in just the right way. So I got that same kind of feeling at the end of Oppenheimer, where it was like, oh shit, that's it. Good stuff. Good times.
And both men are sort of singularly driven by a passion that ends up sort of ruining them later in life. They get what they wanted, and it ends up destroying them on some level. So I think that's a great analogy. And I think, too, I would even point to The Prestige, Nolan's earlier film, to talk about how every century there are sort of people generally in the highest levels of power, and during the Middle Ages, for example, it could have been religious figures, popes and priests, and people able to translate the words of the Bible or some other canonical text. And then as we enter the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, more and more of that power was transferred over to scientists. And Oppenheimer is sort of a leading example of how the success of the 20th century, of who won these wars, was determined more by science than by any other type of leader, you could argue, or at least had a large hand in it. So I think The Prestige talks about that as well. It begins with sort of mysticism and being driven by this passion of creating this illusion for society, and in the end it's science that becomes their undoing, because it takes it to new heights that they can no longer control.
Kind of also brings me back to a Jurassic Park quote, and I'm going to paraphrase this because I'm going to get it wrong, but when Ian says, your scientists were so concerned with thinking if they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
Beautiful.
That is a great representation of kind of another thing that you and I have just touched on through the years about, like, science is incredibly powerful, undoubtedly, but when we kind of talk about science versus religion, just in the sense of like, I don't exactly know what I'm trying to say in this little thesis statement here, but religion tends to be, it's like a moral code, right? I mean, that's a huge generalization, but for the most part, religion's part of their motivation is to have some sort of moral code for you to live by, and whether or not that comes from like a story, a 10 Commandments, whatever. But science doesn't really give you a what to do with that information. It tends to just give you that information, because that's the whole point, in essence, of science, is to be like, we want to find out the answers, but it's not it can't ever be really morality answers. And we could talk a little bit about where psychology is in that world, but I don't want to dive too deep. I just want to say that Ian quote in Jurassic Park is a great sort of memorable moment.
Probably steer back to Oppenheimer soon, but I'll say one last thought on what you were saying. In the late 1800s, Nietzsche comes along and declares God is dead, right? Huge banner in the world of philosophy. And what has it been replaced with? Well, he argues it's been replaced with sort of a new religion of science, right? But he says the tragedy of the loss of religion is that people will replace that with nihilism because, like you said, where do you draw meaning? Science doesn't give you meaning. It just gives you, scientific principles, right? Objective takes on reality as close as we can get. And so he says, well, it's actually not something to be afraid of. This nihilism, it's not, he was worried that people would just become apathetic and just seek pleasure and, not really pursue anything once they've moved on from the grip of religion. But he said it's actually a very freeing thing, and it means that you get to create your own meaning and you get to create your own passions. There's this great YouTube channel, like Stories of Old. This guy, he kind of breaks down film and connects it to philosophy. He does this with Kierkegaard, who was this existentialist philosopher in the 1900s, and connects Oppenheimer to Kierkegaard and talks about this exact thing. Huge recommendation, very good. Long videos, but they're really interesting and very fun.
And isn't it kind of cool what you're talking about, that weirdly enough, nihilism can kind of like circle you back into optimism in that way? A very common just thing for people to think about and talk about today is like, oh my God, the world's going to end. Like climate change. We're all going to die. Climate change. Which, yeah, we need to focus on that. We need to work through that. But that thought is, I think, kind of a little bit what you're talking about in the same sense that it's objectively, it's a very nihilistic thing to think. Like, the world is going to end. Climate change is going to kill us all. But at the same time, that can be kind of freeing. And I guess the weird, like, little metaphor that I would put this into is when people talk about, like, if you had one day to live, you can take that totally anyway. One day to live sounds very negative. It tends to be very nihilistic, like, oh my God, wow, I only have 24 hours. That's tragic. I'm going to die. Death is at my doorstep. At the same time, that is also incredibly freeing because you can basically do anything. Because if you know that this great, terrible ending is coming, nothing matters. And it's a beautiful nothing matters because you can make your own meaning.
Well, that's very well said, Kim. And you just had a birthday, so you basically only have a day left anyway. You're getting so old.
Yeah, I have -1 days left. I don't know if that made any sense. That made sense to me. Yeah, my birthday was yesterday, guys. I'm 28 now. Look at that.
Oof.
Now you know my age. Now you can steal my identity. I guess we should probably get back on topic again. So how do I spin this back into Oppenheimer? Big bombs. Big bomb. Okay, hang on. Can we just for a second, specifically like the test bomb in this film, there was a ton of hype online about what, like, Nolan spent so much time and effort trying to craft a practical effect bomb that was as close as he could get to a nuclear bomb without it, of course, being a nuclear bomb. So there was so much hype online, like, oh my God, this is going to be such a great bomb, like, practical effects, yay, cool, amazing. And maybe this is just me having experience in the film industry where I've worked with explosions on set and having seen them in real life, but I was very underwhelmed with the actual explosion. How did you feel?
Yeah, I heard that sentiment by a few people too, actually. I don't think you're alone in that. And I think, on some level, I agree. I know that for Nolan, the important scene of the bomb going off is not so much the explosion itself, but the view of Oppenheimer watching the explosion through the goggles, through the glass, and it's blasting him in the face as he's looking at it, right? So yeah, anyway, but I think that, I think I agree that the explosion itself didn't feel as, there wasn't quite like the far zoomed out shot that maybe you were looking for that shows the magnitude of the thing all at once. The only time we really get that is when we're so far away that it no longer looks like this massive menacing thing. It's kind of too distant on the horizon maybe. So I think that's a valid criticism. I would just say that I don't think, in a weird sort of way, I don't think it's actually Nolan's focus of the film. I think the film is much more about Oppenheimer than it is about the bomb itself. But that's a whole can of worms to get into, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
I'm going to regret saying this, but trying to sort of separate Oppenheimer from the bomb, I get it because there's a lot to talk about on both sides. At the same time, it does feel a little bit separate the artist from the art, you know? You know, when people come up with that argument of like, oh, so-and-so who murdered 6 people in the 70s made some really great like canvas prints, and like we should just separate the artist from the art, stuff like that. And where I land on this argument currently is that I think there's a certain degree at which like you can separate because everybody is a flawed human and has their things, but bigger crimes, like let's say in this stupid example of you murdered 6 people, I don't think you can really separate that from the art, especially if you murder about 200,000 people, right? Is that the number that we're going with currently? That we know of, at least, with how many people died from these 2 bombings?
Yeah, I think that's the initial number, and then an additional 200,000 or so died from radiation poisoning and just, you know, over the following weeks and such. Yeah, huge numbers.
Another interesting part on that number, or I guess that like vague concept of numbers, we will obviously never know because it's going to be impossible to really go back in history and ever calculate that so precisely. But it's also going to be hard because like we live in America. We grew up in America, the country that literally dropped those bombs. And for all we know, there will always be a level of those fatality statistics that is going to be skewed. For all we know, the reality is 1 million people fully died between those 2 days. And we won't ever, I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying? Like our information of that historical event will always be a bit skewed by the fact that we are coming from this country and we have like learned everything living in this country that is at fault for that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, estimates for even the American Civil War, they range by like 100,000 people. It's just hard when there are tragedies of that scale. It's just hard to get accurate numbers. So that's definitely possible. I think a question that is still fiercely debated to this day is whether those bombs needed to be dropped at all. You know, the overarching argument was that it would shorten the war and fewer people would die if it happened all at once, as opposed to a full-scale invasion of Japan, right? That was the main justification. And it convinced most Americans at the time. When the bombs dropped, 90% of Americans were in favor of them dropping. And a few short weeks later, Japan surrenders, and it seems like this thing was a resounding success. And then over time, as history has had the chance to kind of review documents, review what was happening with leaders at the time, have a more objective take on it, and people were living less in fear of the war and could have a more kind of objective take on history, that approval of the bombs dropping has dropped dramatically. Every single generation is less in favor of those bombs having dropped. And right now it's around like a 50-50 split, if not leaning a little bit against the idea of it, right? So luckily you and I will single-handedly settle this debate once and for all. And there's no need for further discussion. The answer is, go ahead, Kim.
Could you repeat the question? After your sip of red wine?
Oh, sorry. Did you notice this wine? In fact...
What is it? Is it a Chianti? Is it a... Oh, my God. For the people listening, the brand of wine is called Boom Boom! !
Yeah, which...
God, that's amazing.
I think is actually probably in poor taste. I just wanted like a fun, thematic wine for this evening. However, literally it is not
Nothing
poor
matters.
taste. It's actually quite refreshing. It's nice.
Love a good wine. But anyways, your question, how would you rephrase that in a single sentence for those of us, myself?
Well, I think what we're all curious about, Kim, is just the simple answer, yes or no, of whether America was justified in dropping the bombs on Japan.
No. Immediate no.
And there you have it, folks. We can move right along.
This is coming from someone who I don't like the word devout in this context, but it's all I can think of. I'm very, like, a devout pacifist. I almost always believe that violence is not going to really solve anything. That, however, is coming from someone who, like, I'm a white woman living in America. I'm incredibly privileged, so it's a lot easier to, proclaim yourself a pacifist when you live in a position of privilege. So keep that in mind. All that being said, though, no, I don't think you fucking just, I don't think most wars are justified, let alone to the degree that in 2 days, how many people died, how many innocent people died at the hands of this basically still kind of experimental bomb. It's insane. I mean, it's just, problems are never going to be solved by killing people. And I don't know why it feels like that still sounds like such a radical thing to say, because it's so easy when you have anger towards someone or something. It's so easy for you to be like, kill them. Like, if they're dead, that solved my problem. It's a very human thing of us, and we all fall into it. But it's not ever going to work. And I don't want to divert too much in this conversation, but there's a lot that I think is interesting about the progression of Marvel films from like early 2000s to now, as far as that goes, because Marvel films, superhero films are very much, there's a bad guy, we kill the bad guy, we win. And in the past several years, that's changed. I mean, most notably, one of the Spider-Man movies, one of the live-action Spider-Man movies, literally took famous Spider-Man villains, brought them into sort of this course of Spider-Man, and instead of being like, oh, I guess we gotta kill them all again, the whole idea of that film was, how do we attempt to rehabilitate these people? Because that is what is actually going to solve the problem, is trying to work with a person or a group of people rather than just outright kill them. And to kind of bring this back a little bit to Oppenheimer and just that era, we theoretically, quote unquote, defeated the Nazis, right? If you want to just like put all of this into a little lovely little wrapped up bow, World War II ended and the Nazis were defeated. Yay, no more genocide ever. That is so not the case. Anybody who is alive and has 2 eyes and 2 ears in the year 2023 knows we literally have Nazis on the streets of the United States of America. We don't have to dive too deep into that, but this just kind of goes to further prove my point of killing people is never gonna fucking solve things. Ooh, don't even get me started. We could talk all about also the Afghanistan war as far as that goes too. Partially such a clear situation of we see, the US sees an enemy and there's so many attempts to kill, even if you, I'm getting heated. I'm getting so heated. I'll stop here, but I just want to wrap this up by saying, no, I don't think the atomic bombs were justified. I don't think the atomic bombs would ever be justified. I would go so far as to say there is nothing that could happen that would ever justify that sort of reaction. Because at the end of the day, you are only killing innocent people. Your problem in any sort of war is a system of government and what they're doing. Your problem is not the people who live there and are just subject to that system of government, whether they like it or not. Even if they fucking love that government. Like, they're not necessarily, I don't know. Again, I'm getting heated. Long story short, no, I don't think they were justified. I don't think they will ever be justified. I don't like Oppenheimer. And to bring it back to the movie for a second, I really just don't like that we made a movie about it. And I don't think that making the movie was really justified.
Oh, wow. Okay, so now we're getting really into Oppenheimer here. I'll say to connect to your last point, that every hate movement knows that the more you can dehumanize a group, the easier it is to justify violence against them. And that's why approval ratings would have been so high at the time, is because Japan was very clearly the enemy. And, I mean, we put Japanese Americans into internment camps at the time. We had so successfully dehumanized them within our own country even. But please expand more on your thoughts on the idea of Oppenheimer getting a film himself.
Yeah, so that's kind of a big one. And a reminder to anybody listening, if you don't know, I work in the film industry. I've been working in the film industry since, technically my first official industry gigs were in college. So sometime after 2013. I live in Los Angeles. I've been working in the industry in Los Angeles for over 6 years. So with that knowledge and kind of everything that I see and know about the industry and about films, it's hard for me to justify why a film like this why a film like this was funded and put forward, other than I get that it's like a Nolan kind of passion project and he's a very famous guy, he's got a big name, all that stuff. And I'll compare it to Barbie for a second, because we will talk about Barbie a little bit. We are at a point in time, it's 2023, we are at a point in time where the general public, the general international sort of audiences are not only willing to go see a movie like Barbie, but love it enough that it is one of the highest grossing films of all time already, which is incredible. So we're at a time where that is internationally loved. That's a lot, because that film is technically kind of more like radical than most other films that, you know, sort of, how do I put this? More of like feminist type films about women, supporting women, trying to talk about all that. So that kind of thing being said, films like that can come out and are loved around the world. To compare it to Oppenheimer, it's like, why can we put a film like Barbie and love that and be like, this is cool, this is amazing, this is the right time for this. And also at the exact same time, like the exact same release date, we're still making the kind of movies that Oppenheimer is a film that I think makes a lot more sense coming out like 20 years ago. You know? I don't know. It's not saying anything I think that we want right now. It's barely even saying anything, I would argue. I would argue that there's enough vagueness in the overall lesson kind of thing that it just doesn't feel like we're giving anything, we're putting forth anything powerful into the world. This feels, again, like a movie that I think would have been better made 20 years ago.
That's interesting. And when you say 20 years ago, because the Soviet Union was more of a factor, well, I mean, it maybe 30 years ago.
Well, that is exactly how I would contextualize it, Luke.
Okay.
By the Soviet Union. I wouldn't know the specifics. I think that's kind of just me sort of pulling a number out of my head. But that's just to say that this film, in my opinion, and please like fight me on this because this is what this is all about. But in my opinion, this film doesn't, hey, we made a bomb and that's a bad thing and we are sad about it. It doesn't say that. It really, at the end of the day, it kind of says, hey, we made a bomb. A couple of people are a little sad about it, but not much is happening. Movie. That's kind of the vibe that I got.
Do you think it glorifies Oppenheimer's life, or suggests this was either a good or bad thing, or do you think it leaves that open to interpretation for the audience?
I think open to interpretation for sure, which is, kind of going back, part of my problem with it is I think we should be at a point right now where we can clearly and loudly state this was wrong and we should not have done this and this is bad. I think the messaging of this film should have been more clearly Oppenheimer sucks and this was bad. You know what I mean? It was ambiguous. And I think that's cool for movies in general because people are ambiguous and there is no fully good or fully bad. But again, this is a huge historical event that most Americans know very little about. And I mean, for obvious reasons. So it's like, I don't know. Am I kind of making sense with at least where I'm coming from when I say that I think this film should have put its foot down and said something more powerful? I think we're at a place in time where it could have done that, and it should have done that with such a heavy subject matter, and it didn't do that. It decided to be more ambiguous. It decided to be more like, you decide for yourself. And I think that's not good because there are so many people who will now interpret that a little bit more sympathetic to Oppenheimer than I think we should be.
So I think that's certainly valid criticism, and I understand where you're coming from. I would say that, from my opinion, I think your frustrations are actually directed at Oppenheimer where they should be directed at the systems that Oppenheimer was a part of. So I don't think you can blame Oppenheimer the man for the creation of the atomic bomb. I think it would have happened regardless of whether he was there or not. The question is whether America would have been the one to come up with the bomb, or, I mean, it gets so deeply into speculation and so quickly that there's really no way to even have a conversation about like what it would be like if Oppenheimer wasn't there or if the bomb had never been dropped or something. It's just too speculative. But
theory can only get you so far.
Theory can only get you so far, Kim. And we're too busy asking whether or not we could have dropped the bombs that we didn't stop to think if we should. But I understand your point, but I think, to me, the takeaway of the film, particularly that last scene, what he says to Einstein, he says, I think I created a chain reaction that will end the world. And then the last shots of the film are him flying in a plane as nuclear bombs drop left and right, like raindrops, the same kind of raindrops we see in the first scene of the film. They drop like raindrops all over the earth, destroying the earth. And to me, it's at least suggestive of this is something we can no longer control. I don't think it's a fatalistic thing in that this is our inevitable future, that we're going to die in some nuclear holocaust event. But I do think the movie is suggesting that this was not a good development in history, but it was an inevitable one, and we have to live with the ramifications of that. I think Oppenheimer himself, not to speak for the guy, but within 15 minutes of him learning that you could split the nucleus of an atom, he realized that you could use that to get energy out of that exchange and out of that reaction. And when that happens, you could not only create an energy source, but you could also create a bomb, because a bomb is just a rapid explosion of energy, right? So he knew, and this was in like the 1920s when this is discovered, and he knew that as soon as that was possible, that a bomb would essentially be inevitable. It was just a matter of time. And at that point in his life, he was so motivated against fascism because he saw it as this especially anti-Jewish campaign, but just anti-humanitarian campaign, that I think he saw it as his life's work to defeat Nazis. And he could do that through science by creating this bomb first. But I mean, yeah, it's just like, it's this weird situation where my takeaway from reading this book is that as soon as science knew it was possible to create a nuclear bomb, given the circumstances of a world war and the fervor for war that the Nazis had at the time, it was essentially inevitable that a bomb would be created. And as Oppenheimer said, I'd rather the Americans have the bomb than the Nazis. But then the Nazis are defeated, the bomb is still not finished, and yet they finish the bomb and they drop it after the Nazis are defeated on Japan. So that's a separate issue of whether that's justified or not. But the fact that the Nazis had already been defeated suggests that maybe the whole thing could have been avoided at that point, right?
Yeah, no, you make excellent points. A little bit of what you're talking about is kind of something that I think about a lot, going back to sort of the theory of, if I didn't do it, would somebody else have done it, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, even just at large, that topic of, is it better for the Americans to have it than the Nazis to have it? The Nazis would have dropped it anyways, whatever, and we'll never know. But when we think about that kind of stuff, and a lot of times I think about, do you ever get like a bad idea? And duh, but I mean, do you ever get like such a bad idea?
Never.
Where you think about something and you're like, wow, if this particular thing were to exist, there would be so much damage in the world. Sometimes I will have moments like that. And I know there are other people in the world that have moments like that, where there's a light bulb that goes off in your head, but it's like a bad light bulb, like a very particularly bad light bulb. Not just an intrusive thought of like, oh, what if I punched this guy? But like a particular thing or event that could happen that could specifically cause a lot of damage. When I think about that, and I know, again, other people have these thoughts, I always wonder, like, to relate it back to Oppenheimer, if you're Oppenheimer and you have that idea and you're like, whoa, okay, cool, I figured out the bomb, guys, we got this big bomb, here it is. I think, why, I guess, why is it so hard to just stop it right there? Why is it so hard to just say, this is such a bad idea, I can't trust even myself with this kind of thing? And why can't we get to that point where it's like, if I'm thinking about this, if I've just come up with the atomic bomb and I just shut it down here for myself, maybe we never have an atomic bomb. Maybe nobody else comes up with it. Or maybe at the very least it takes them longer than it would take me. I guess, do you see what I'm saying? Just on the sense of like, I don't know. I wish that more people with these ideas historically might have just stopped themselves then and there, instead of going into that mindset like we're talking about, where it's saying like, well, damn it, I had this really terrible idea, but I guess I gotta do it so somebody else doesn't do it. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I would refer back to my quote that I think agrees with you, my original quote. I don't wish the culmination of 3 centuries of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're alluding to there. I guess I would just say that the wider scientific community, including the German scientific community, the Nazis, they understood the potential for a bomb as well, particularly Werner Heisenberg, who was the sort of counterpart to Oppenheimer and headed the Nazi division trying to build their own atomic bomb. And he actually knew him. They were classmates at a time, a little bit of rivals when they were in their early 20s. So I think in Oppenheimer's mindset, it wasn't just that he alone had this idea. It was that the world was now had a sort of loss of innocence, that science had come so far that we were now capable of a weapon of mass destruction. And so I think you can trace Oppenheimer's thought patterns into essentially 3 stages. And this is something that you actually see in the film, I think. And I think it's a testament to Cillian Murphy, who, oh boy, we got to talk about Cillian Murphy, one of my favorite actors.
Stunning. I
got to do a whole thing about him at some point. But stage 1 of his thinking is we have to be first past the post. We got to be the first ones to develop this bomb. And then when they finally get there, it's actually Niels Bohr, played by Kenneth Branagh here, Niels Bohr, who, when they're in the act of developing it, he says, I don't really want to be a part of this. I'm here with a single message, and it's, once we have the bomb, who is going to decide what to do with it, right? A world that has nuclear bombs, we've never lived in that world. How are we going to prepare ourselves for that world? And his suggestion is the first, he suggests a really fascinating idea. I'll tell you in a second here. His suggestion gets Oppenheimer thinking for the first time about the world in which a nuclear bomb exists. Before, he was just so preoccupied with getting there first, right? And now part 2 of his thinking is the Bohrian philosophy, if I will, if I may. The Bohrian approach, which is, let's have a United Nations level government, a government over the world that is capable of denying every country access to developing nuclear weapons itself. That's the punishment, that they're not allowed to develop these weapons. And the carrot, the reward, is that you will help them develop nuclear energy. And so the only way to do this is to have scientists that are freely able to go into every country and inspect their weapons manufacturing facilities and make sure they're not gathering uranium and doing whatever else that needs to be done to develop these bombs. So that's sort of stage 2 of his thinking is, okay, let's influence the government to create this kind of global governance system. And then stage 3 is the second they develop the bomb, it gets whisked away by the military, goes off, and immediately gets dropped without advance notice to them. And he realizes that it was certainly naive and probably a little bit arrogant to think that he would have any say in how the bomb was used. He's just a scientist after all. And so he spends the rest of his life kind of speaking out against it. But yeah, I forgot how we got there though.
Moral of the entire podcast all the time. I forget how we get from point A to point B, but we move on to point C. And point C is, I want to kind of like divert us for a minute. And I want to go back to on the adaptation of it all, right? Again, this film was an adaptation of the whole story of Oppenheimer, but a very direct adaptation of the particular biography that we mentioned. You read, and then I skimmed the first couple of pages and then got busy with life. That's, and I will say that I think what a noble sacrifice of me to stop myself before I read this book.
Yeah. That exhibits great self-control, Kim.
Thank you so much. I really worked hard to not finish reading this book so that you could.
I was so excited when I heard Oppenheimer was coming out. I love Chris Nolan. I was like, wow, and we're getting Cillian Murphy in this thing. I reached out to immediately and I was like, let's do this book. This is going to be great. And then I look online at the book and it goes 821 pages. And I was like, oh, what have I done?
Which is kind of the first point I will give Nolan as far as the adaptation goes. You took a long book and you made it a long movie. So you definitely paid attention to the details and kept as much in as you could. Yay. That's
Yes.
one point on the adaptation, on the adaptation scoreboard.
Yeah. Actually, I misspoke.
And then another point that I will give you. Yeah, go ahead.
So, okay, so the book is 721 pages. And the actual book itself, the writing of the book, is actually a clean 600. So it's practically, it's like a novella. Those last 120 pages are just footnotes. So it's really not that big of an undertaking.
Yeah, those last 120 pages. But I love that. Another point that I want to give just on the adaptation scoreboard that I can sort of bring to the conversation here is the title, again, being like American Prometheus, and then a bunch of words. Very obvious, right? It very obviously gives you that, like, this is about a guy who flew too close to the sun. And the marketing of this film, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the posters. Again, I live in Los Angeles, so we have film posters at every single bus stop. And my car doesn't work, so I've been using all the bus stops to get around town. So I've seen a ton of different Oppenheimer posters, and there's like 3 or 4 in circulation. But the main one is so blatantly like a Prometheus call out. It's, it's our guy looking through goggles, looking through a little window at what is presumably the distant bomb explosion, but it is so great and it is so bright that the entire poster is like pretty much overexposed intentionally. Right? And that's such a clear, it's almost like, I don't know why I'm like a little bit mad about it. It's almost a little bit annoying how like blatant it is about like, you flew too close to the sun, guys. Get it? The whole poster's super bright.
Okay.
But
All right.
it makes that point. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think you're conflating 2 old Greek dudes here. So Icarus is the
Are
one
they
who...
different from... Oh my god.
Yeah, so Icarus flew too close to the sun.
So if you're listening to this podcast,
but
I never said that at all.
Okay, yeah. We can always cut that out. It never happened. But
wow.
But you're not far off. I mean, thematically, it totally jives because Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, to people. And for that, he's tortured for eternity. Which is why the name Prometheus for the ship in the film Prometheus is just a terrible name. Why would you ever name a spaceship after that? It's ridiculous. You would never do that.
Okay, first of all, thank you for fucking stopping me and fact checking me, because I'm not great when it comes to mythology.
Old Greek guys, yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely more Norse mythology. That's my game. Particularly one character in Norse mythology. But we'll get on that another day.
Yeah, when it comes to the Greeks, I just know those 2 and Zach Galifianakis. That's about the extent of my knowledge.
Zach Galifianakis? Is he Greek?
Yeah, heck yeah, he is.
Good for him. Is he going to be in My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3?
I assume.
I hope so.
Director, writer, star.
That's what you gotta do. That's the name of the game. That's the business. Okay, so again, thank you for correcting me on that. Nonetheless, the similarity, still a point for Nolan as far as that kind of obvious symbolism being portrayed in the marketing. And, it's a very clear, it's a point. It's a point for him as far as the adaptation goes. You're keeping the vibes of the source material and bringing it over. Even if people like me get the Greek guys confused a little bit. But fire!
Yeah.
It's all the same. The sun is a big fireball.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Icarus had his wings melted and he fell into the sea, and I assume he drowned. And really, between that and being chained to a rock and having a bird eat your intestines forever, I'm not sure which one I would prefer personally, but they're both bad. The Greeks, man, and in fact, let me even tie this to something that's not overtly mentioned in the book or the film, but Oedipus, I think, has a very similar trajectory in life to Oppenheimer himself. Chased by sort of a singular ambition, fated to create disaster, works his whole life towards his own path, and in the true form of a tragedy, ends up sort of creating his own demise, right? So, yeah, anyway, the Greeks, they knew how to tell a story.
We should talk sometime about the notable pitfalls of the Greek tragedy, and especially the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I've got some thoughts on that, and some of my thoughts, so I'll just give you a little spark notes. Some of my thoughts on that whole self-fulfilling prophecy thing are that it is bullshit. But that is a discussion for something far more related to self-fulfilling prophecies and Greek stories in general.
I do think it's relevant to Nolan's entire oeuvre, because I do think most of his lead characters are singularly driven by a passion of theirs that ends up sort of destroying them. And I do think, and this is a longer conversation to get to, but I think if you look at his past, 11 movies or so, I think you can make the argument that Oppenheimer is sort of the culmination of all of his interests and his passions and his filmmaking capabilities. And he managed to find a real person that fit the bill of everything he's interested in telling. You know, a person singularly driven by their passions who's then left in ruins after, and the world is never the same.
I would, just for the sake of flavoring the conversation, I would dabble in some Barbie here by saying that I think you could argue, an argument could be made that Barbie herself was very singularly motivated and did not blow up in her face in the same way. And maybe I'm just fucking bringing this in for no reason other than to start shit. But you make an excellent point. As far as the stories that Nolan himself is drawn to. Do you think, let me kind of like tie this back to something I wanted to mention. Do you know that Robert Pattinson gave him the book? Do you know that whole bit, or should I say it?
Yeah. Oh, shoot. I thought that'd be a fun Easter egg. I didn't know you knew that. I was going to blow your mind with that information. But go ahead, tell the audience.
And I knew this exact moment was going to happen because I know you well enough to the extent that when I learned that piece of information, I was like, oh, Luke is going to know this and he's going to want to bring this to the podcast.
I mean, anything with our Pats.
Oh, yeah. He's incredible. And he's a fantasy cast in one of my films in the future. Can't wait to work with him. Going to be great. For the listeners, if you don't know, Robert Pattinson, who starred in Christopher Nolan's film Tenet, which came out in 2020, infamously came out in 2020. So Robert Pattinson gave this Oppenheimer book to Nolan. Was it during or after the filming?
It was after, as like an exchange of gifts, which is kind of a cool tradition I didn't know about. But I guess the head talent and the creative team, a bit of a tradition, maybe just in that one case, but they exchange gifts as like a sign of thank you for having worked together.
Nice. That's cute. So he gave Nolan this book after the filming of Tenet, and obviously that's kind of like where it all began. Nolan read the book and was like, oh my god, this is amazing, I gotta make a movie. But one thing that I kind of want to say/ask about that is, do you think that Robert Pattinson was kind of reading Christopher Nolan in the sense when he gave him that book? You know, do you think that Robert Pattinson was like, oh my god, Chris is going to eat this shit up because it is his whole life is this kind of story?
So I'll say two things here. One is the version of the story I heard, and I mean, this is all just like, Hollywood Reporter stuff, so I'm not exactly sure how factual it is, but the version I heard is that he gifted Nolan, it wasn't the book, but handwritten letters from Oppenheimer.
Oh.
Which I can say, having read the book, that Oppenheimer would write at least a letter a week. You know, I mean, this is a time before the internet when the only way of corresponding with your friends and family and everything was to just sit down and take an evening and write a long letter and send it out. And then you would traditionally hold on to those letters for years, you know, your entire lifetime. And you would have this huge accumulated stack of letters. And that's what Martin Sherwin and Kai Bird leaned so heavily on when they did this book. There's a whole story I can tell you about how they wrote this book, but it was a massive undertaking. It required 25 years, and they accumulated 50,000 pages of notes. So writing the book was its own journey into itself. Anyway, but that's another story, I suppose. So there's a reference to Oppenheimer in the movie Tenet when they're walking along that sort of airport runway, two characters, and they talk about how, in fact, it's that same line we were talking about earlier, the fact that when they were creating the bomb, they didn't know if it would ignite the entire atmosphere, and sort of reflecting on the idea of like science in theory only getting you so far and getting out of our control. And they tie that into the time machine device that's at the core of Tenet. But anyway, so I think that is, to me, that's what motivated Robert Pattinson to send him those handwritten letters, because it was clear that Oppenheimer was someone that Nolan was interested in. One thing I love about Robert Pattinson, too, is that he's just sort of like an eccentric guy with eccentric interests to begin with. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was just like trying to send a wild card into Nolan's life.
Good point. Yeah. I really did think it was the book. Where did I read that it was the book? And definitely didn't fact check myself. Damn. I will, again, thank you for being on this podcast. I love that. Thank you for being that person who was like, I have my facts so clearly listed on my 12-page document in front of me.
I don't got a lot going on, Kim.
No, but I love it. I'm glad that you don't have anything going on, because then you can be the expert on the podcast and you can check us during the podcast, and it helps because we live in a dark time of misinformation, Luke, and any amount of just fact checking or at least, mind opening of the information is helpful. So I appreciate it.
Of course, and I'll add on to that too. I think that's exactly right, and the film Oppenheimer is meticulously accurate to the book, arguably to a flaw, depending on some of the negative criticism that the film has received. But I can say that almost every single line of dialogue, almost every single scene in the film is plucked directly out of the book. And so if you have criticisms with the film, the argument could be made that it's really a criticism with the book. So for example, one of the leading criticisms that I've seen online is that there is 0 time spent on the Japanese perspective of the Manhattan Project or the aftermath of the bombings. We don't even see the bombings. All we see is he's in a room, Oppenheimer is looking at a projector, and when they show the aftermath of the bombings, he kind of looks away. And we don't see what he's seeing, we just see him, right? Now this is Nolan being singularly focused on Oppenheimer, the person, more so than the external objective events of the world. And that's a longer conversation, but I do think Nolan has always been sort of singularly focused on the subjective nature of reality from the perspective of a person, right? Memento being maybe the most obvious example because he can't form new memories, so his entire world is subjective to what he's written in his most recent memories. So that's a large criticism of the film, is that we don't see the devastation, so it's hard to, for an audience that's maybe not as familiar with the story, it's hard for us to truly judge the weight of the disaster of this bomb. And my best response to that would be the book spends 0 time on the Japanese perspective as well. And so maybe you fault the book and not the movie for that. But then I was talking to a friend of mine after we walked out of the theater, and I made this same point to her, and she made a great point. Thank you, Layla. You're out there. Layla said to me, well, how many people do you think have seen this movie? How many people do you think read this 700-page book?
Damn right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the interesting thing, is that movies as an art form are more a historical record for the current generation, the current time that we're in, arguably, than books are, as far as what is in the popular discourse. So maybe movies do have this obligation to cover as much around the historical record as possible. And I don't think that I have a clear answer on that. I just think it's interesting to think about.
100%. 100%. And this is, I'm going to sidetrack for a quick second, but this is something that I've learned a lot more in life and working in the industry, but particularly hosting a podcast about adaptations has helped me more appreciate adaptations and also sequels, reboots, that kind of thing. Because years ago, I'm sure, you were there for, I've had rants to you several times about being like, oh, there's so many sequels nowadays. There's so many reboots. We all have this kind of rant, right? A lot of us will be like, God, there's so much unoriginal content. I just wish every movie was original. And I get that, and I totally respect that. I think for the most part, we should be promoting original content far more than we do these days. However, I think there is a huge benefit to adapting books, adapting other media and materials, and having reboots and sequels, because kind of like what you're saying, there's always going to be sort of a new audience, right? Like there's a far different audience that reads the book versus reads the movie. So it's like, and we can't even really say, is the book better than the movie? Is the movie better than the book? It's always comparing apples to oranges. It's always kind of like, at the end of the day, impossible to really make a definitive statement of what is better life for that story, I guess. Some of them it's a little bit more cut and dry. We can be a little bit more laissez-faire about that. But what I'm trying to say here is adaptations are fascinating. Adaptations bring a whole new life to a story, and that can be anything. We could have had an Oppenheimer film that focused almost exclusively on Japan and the Japanese people, which it would have technically been like a bad adaptation as far as you're translating the source material wildly differently than it was. However, it's not necessarily a better or worse adaptation. It's just a different way of bringing that story to life. Kind of in the same way of just like, ooh, and I'm gonna touch on a sore subject for a second, but Nolan directed this film. Nolan brought this film to the screen, but theoretically any director could have done that, and it could have been in their, totally different style, maybe a very similar style, and it just would have been different. Again, my weird thesis statement to this whole thing, going back to what you're talking about, is that adaptations are fascinating, and there is no right or wrong answer. Art is subjective, guys. There's only like 5 movies that you definitively have to hate, and they're the 5 movies that I hate. So you have to agree with me, because I said so.
I do think that there's this Timothée Chalamet quote, and this will sound absurd, but I swear it's like foundational to my life these days. I was watching this interview with Timmy, and he said, "I feel so lucky to be living in a time in which the thing that I can do, I can act. I can't sing opera, but opera isn't what changes popular discourse anymore. The opera is out there. You can go and watch opera, but the news cycle is not reacting to opera the way it did maybe 100 years ago, 200 years ago." He said, "I feel so lucky that the talent I have and that I've developed and managed to make it in acting is what drives discourse these days." And I think about that all the time. I think movies, they can be anything they want, but in the similar way to maybe paintings of a few hundred years ago, because they were the closest we had to preserving memory of a visual image, they had this sort of sacred obligation to be faithful to that person, right? It's only when photography came along and we could actually get an exact image of someone that painting, the art form, exploded in different directions, and you get Van Gogh's surrealism, and you get Jackson Pollock doing these abstract expressionist paintings, right? Because we no longer needed painting as a profession to capture reality. We had cameras to do that. So I think film is sort of the last and highest art form right now, because it is capable of wrapping all other art forms into itself, and it has the popular clout to change the conversation.
Love it. I love just even talking about the different types of media that we have nowadays, and how we've sort of, the words are not coming to me, but how we've sort of, like you're saying, pop culture is differently influenced by different types of media. Even, TikTok it's not its own type of media, but it's in there, right? And it's shaping our world in unprecedented ways. We don't have to talk about TikTok. What I want to talk about, Luke, is that Paul Giamatti should have played Albert Einstein. And let me tell you why I say that. There was a phone company commercial. I don't remember what phone company it was, and I don't want to remember because capitalism. There was a phone commercial like 2 years ago that came out, and there was like a character in that commercial that was like Albert Einstein, and it was played by Paul Giamatti. And I remember the first second I saw that, I was so disappointed, because I was like, you just wasted perfect casting on a commercial. Paul Giamatti, Einstein? Okay, tell me that wouldn't have been great because he's Paul Giamatti.
I think I remember this commercial. Was it singular?
It probably was.
I think I remember this. Yeah, it was like a totally star-studded commercial. It was fantastic.
Yeah, out of nowhere, which like props to the casting director, like you crushed it. But also like I kind of wish you would have crushed it a little bit less. Kind of in the way that I wish that Oppenheimer would have crushed it a little bit less. You know, like toned himself down. The casting director of that commercial, you had too much power and maybe you should have toned yourself down because Paul Giamatti would have played an absolutely excellent Albert Einstein in a fully fleshed out film like this. And that's not to say I think the actor who played Einstein in this film did a great job as well. But this is just something that will stay in my mind for the rest of ever until Paul Giamatti finally gets the chance to officially play Einstein. And maybe I will have to just do an Einstein movie specifically to get that casting to happen. But
I wish Paul Giamatti was in every role in this film. I love that guy. I had this conversation with my brother after coming out of the theater. He said that, this 3-hour, very serious, highly dialogue-driven film about all these grave consequences, you get Einstein in there, and he's doing sort of like vaudevillian comedy. Like he's sort of like the bumbling guy. He's dropping his hat everywhere. He just looks... his hair's all disheveled, like he pops out of nowhere. But the only time the audience erupted in laughter in my theater was when the cab takes off in the middle of the night and emerging from the darkness, Einstein walks out into the road and like greets Oppenheimer. And it's like, yeah, like that did seem a little silly to me. But I will say though, that it is true that they had a close friendship. They both worked together for several years. And in fact, Oppenheimer's office was like directly above or beneath Einstein's, and they would go on walks together. In fact, on Einstein's birthday, I think it was his 60th or 70th, some banner year, Oppenheimer walked him home, got him a radio to put on his roof of his house right off of campus because he was living too far away from New York City to hear the symphony orchestras play over the radio. So he got this range extender so that Einstein could hear the orchestra play. And he said Einstein loved it and was like in tears because he was finally able to hear the music again. So beautiful little stories. They were close friends, and I think we get some of that in the film, which was nice. I think also too, Nolan smartly was like, there's a lot of big names in science in this story, and it's a little overwhelming. But we all know Einstein, and if I can kind of focus the story around Einstein and Oppenheimer, I think people will intuitively grasp what's going on here a little bit better, which I think was, a smart decision.
Mm-hmm. It also does, and I don't really have like an opinion one way or the other on this, but I will say it also for me, it gave more humanity to Oppenheimer, who, again, a figure of a very dark moment in human history. And I think anybody coming into that film will kind of immediately have, I kind of hope they have like an immediate bias against Oppenheimer to an extent because of that. So I will say Einstein is that character, and, the interactions between Oppenheimer and Einstein, of course, help you feel a bit more humanity towards Oppenheimer.
What's interesting to me is your take there of like wanting the audience to not like Oppenheimer, because I think
so bad. I want them to hate him.
So I think at the very least, the film wants you to be neutral on him. I don't think they want you to hate him. I think they want you to, in fact, I think the film is less about having an opinion about him than it is about witnessing a real person in history fall victim to their own sort of talents and world view and subjective view of reality and their own passions and possibly hubris and womanizing in his case. But like, I think the film is less about having a take than it is exploring a very complicated figure at a very pivotal time in history. I don't know, does that feel accurate? Like,
I would agree. But I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier a little bit, in the sense that I think that's part of the reason I didn't like the film, is I applaud the fact that to make a movie that can explore so many different aspects of a person's character, good, bad, gray, all of it, is great. And I love that. And I'm glad that we are in this age of film where we can explore more of all that makes a person rather than it being so clear cut, good guy, bad guy. However, and maybe this is really just something that like I myself have to work on as a person and as a viewer. But I think this kind of, you know what, now that I'm saying it, yeah, I got to work on it, because I'm being very hypocritical when I want this person to be so demonized. And like, I mean, yeah, because at the end of the day, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on hundreds of thousands of innocent people and caused irreparable damage, one of the darkest moments of human history, just after one of the darkest moments in human history, the entire Second World War. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know what? I've discovered on this podcast that I need to rewatch Oppenheimer, and I need to allow myself to give Oppenheimer a bit more humanity. But that being said, I should probably also just learn more about the Japanese people in general. Do a little bit of both.
Because I'm interested in playing devil's advocate, I'll say that the bombs did drop and killed many innocent people. And I think that that is something that we have to sort of wrestle with as a society. And the fact that we did that, it was our country who did that. And our greatest minds of our generation, of that generation, used those talents to develop a bomb instead of maybe nuclear fusion or something more useful to society. But we've only ever, in history, the world has only ever dropped 2 nuclear bombs on people. And the last 70 or 80 years or so since then, many will tell you, are the most peaceful years in human history. So there is a long argument to be made that, as devastating as they were, they ushered in an era of unprecedented peace and global cooperation.
Okay, President Snow. What an interesting line of thought you have there. But I completely understand what you're saying. Not that I agree or disagree with it. I see what you're saying. There are a lot of moments in history and in story as well, of course, where something terrible and tragic. I don't think I would say it prevents further tragedy, because that kind of goes along with our sort of theory can only get you so far. We don't really know if we would have had this long of time of quote-unquote peace if we hadn't dropped 2 atomic bombs. You know what I mean? Like, we can't for sure say that, like, well, okay, I guess because we dropped those bombs, like, things were good for a minute, because we don't really know. But yes, I will at least, I'll definitely let you have that point of, like, there are a lot of instances where tragedy at the end of it all kind of again, I don't want to say it's a causation. I will say a lot of times a bad thing happens aside what is seemingly a good thing. Is that just an incredibly vague way of me being like, I have nothing to say here?
No, I think that's an acknowledgement that this is a complicated issue and that there are points to be made on both sides. And I think what this movie is trying to do in general is actually along the same lines. The world is an incredibly complicated place, and it's one thing to learn about these events. It's another thing to have a strong opinion about them. And I think the more you learn, the harder it is to have a strong opinion on many things.
As I am newly 28, I am learning all of these things. See, even today, I've just learned something new. I've learned several new things. I've also learned I need to brush the fuck up on my Greek mythology and Greek understanding, because, wow, that was embarrassing.
Just watch the Hangover movies and you'll get a good sense of Greek life. But not Greek life, but Zach Galifianakis' Greek life.
Got you. So to sort of segue us back, I mean, we're talking a lot about, we've talked a lot about sort of that the world is not as black and white as good and evil. I want to know, what is your take on the use of black and white film versus color film in the film Oppenheimer? Because for those of you listening, if you have seen it, you know what I'm talking about. There's scenes that are in black and white, there are scenes that are in color, it's intermixed. If you haven't seen the film, now you know. There are scenes that are in color, there are scenes that are in black and white, and the scenes are intermixed. So, Luke Dzwonkowski, what are your thoughts?
Well, while we're on the topic of black and white, let me quickly do an addendum here. There is, if you are interested in the Japanese perspective on these events, there is a documentary called White Lightning, Black Rain, and it interviews, it came out just a few years ago, and it interviews people living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of which are young, and some lived through it, and many have burns and are missing limbs and other things that are directly as a result of the bombing. And the documentary opens with an interview of young kids on the street asking them about, do you remember what happened in 1945 on this day? What are your thoughts about that date? And many of these kids who grew up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are like, history was never my thing. I'm not sure what that's referring to. I think there was like a world war at that time, but just complete unawareness of the bombing. And it's so jarring. And then the camera pans over to a woman sitting right there on the street as well. And she is a survivor of the nuclear blast. And there's just this real sense of like time stretching away these generations and how quickly we can forget certain things, right? Anyway, as far as the black and white in the film goes, I think on a technical level, you have to admire Nolan for pushing for these kind of things. This is the first time in history that 70 millimeter black and white film has ever even been used in a film.
Oh, wow.
He reached out to Kodak or whoever makes this stuff. He reached out to them and asked them to develop that film. They'd never done that before. And so they like literally had to like create a new form of 70 millimeter film just for the use in this film, which is so cool. Only Nolan has that kind of pull in the industry to do something like that, I feel like.
A super quick footnote.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the story of Stanley Kubrick. Yuck. But it reminds me of the story of Stanley Kubrick basically being the reason why a certain lens was created, a lens with an incredibly small f-stop. I think it was like 0.7.
0.7 for Barry Lyndon. There's a scene where they're sitting around the dining table and there's one candle in the middle of the table and they're all lit up by this single candle. But the only way to get enough light was to recreate an entire camera system that would allow a 0.7 f-stop, which is just wild. But yes, sorry, continue.
A similar kind of story of just I'm not going to say the word auteur, even though I just said it. A director having such a specified vision of something that they need to sort of create a new technology or work a new technology. If you haven't heard also, oh my God, his name, Jordan Peele. Jordan Peele for the movie Nope. The way that he wanted some of these scenes shot, it was like day for night, which day for night basically means you're shooting in the day, but you want it to look like night, which if you're inside, easy, cover the windows. If you're outside, a lot more difficult, especially if you're in the middle of the desert. So long story short, Jordan Peele alongside his DP, who I think that was Hoyt van Hoytema.
I'm going to double check really quick, but I think you're right.
Thank you. They basically, if you ever look this up, it's so freaking cool. It's like two cameras put at like a 90-degree angle with each other and like a mirror. And basically they were like double shooting this thing, one with infrared film and the other with normal film, so that at the end of it, they could like layer these two images over each other in order to get the best of what they wanted to achieve, which is so cool and is something that like nobody's done before. But again, it was that moment where, a director / DP has such a specified vision of something that can't be accomplished with current technology. And current technology can do so much. So it's really cool when this kind of stuff happens now, when they're like, oh yeah, well, I guess we just had to create a whole new system of shooting this to make it happen. Yes.
And yes, you're right. It was Hoyt van Hoytema, the same DP that has been on every Nolan film since 2014's Interstellar. Mm-hmm. And let me just quickly talk about this guy too, because he is so incredible. Every single one of these 4 films, Interstellar, Dunkirk, Tenet, now Oppenheimer, Hoyt and Nolan have worked together to sort of reinvent what's possible with film. Dunkirk, they strapped these cameras to actual World War II planes flying around, which had never really been done before. They had to kind of like build a rig to work for that. Tenet, I think it's that...
No, it was an interesting film.
I think it was more just like managing to get the cars to drive backwards and to get time to work backwards was a challenge to itself. Oppenheimer, to me, is the most creative use of camera work of Nolan's filmography, because he's using 70 millimeter film to do something that essentially hasn't been done before. 70 millimeter film was sort of popularized a second time around with The Dark Knight. And we get like 10 minutes of it, IMAX film in Dark Knight, during the big chase scenes and action scenes and the semi-truck flipping over on the road. But with Oppenheimer, virtually the entire 3-hour runtime is this IMAX format, or large 70 millimeter, and it's used often and repeatedly to just do close-ups of people's faces in rooms, which is the exact opposite thing you would think it would be used for. You think you would want to get a wide action scene shot with something as expensive as that. And cumbersome, too. These cameras are enormous, and they're so loud that Nolan said that he would often have to, film a scene and then turn the cameras off and record the scene again to capture the audio, have the actors recreate that scene, and just get the audio so that you could stitch it together in post. That's how loud these things are. People said that it sounded like a lawnmower going off, like the actors, because they had never worked around a camera that big before.
Damn, that's crazy.
Yeah.
It's good that they at least, mentioned sort of re-recording the audio on the day instead of either relying for that all to be ADR or going to the sound mixer, sound editor and being like, hey, work with this. There's a giant noise in the background and that's just what it is because I wanted it to look cool. And it does look cool. Ugh, Hoyt, what a guy.
Yeah. And I'll say it's done in service of, again, Nolan's sort of overarching approach to the story in Oppenheimer, which is to get a rigorously subjective first-person perspective of Oppenheimer's perspective on these events. So what better way to do that than to get right up in the guy's face with this beautiful camera, huge, grainy, ton of pixels captured, whatever, like as good a shot as you can get.
Pixels.
I know, no pixels, it's film, but you know what I mean. Then all this information, beautiful right up there. And to do that, and it's just a guy sitting in a room thinking about the implications of something he's done or thinking about a science experiment. I don't know, to me it was like, it showed a confidence in Nolan that I think is earned after all of these previous films. And I think it's part of the reason why, to me, Oppenheimer feels like, I think it will give him the recognition that he has kind of long deserved, but I think he has finally made a film that will achieve all the awards that you might hope for. Like, I think this will win him Best Director. I think it might win Best Picture, Best Score. I think it's going to kind of, arguably it could sweep, Best Actor. I think it's going to be a landmark year for Nolan.
Well, it sounds like that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to Movie Theater Butter, a Till Kim Productions podcast, edited by Kevin Matthew Keeling of Take the World. If you have a free moment, we'd really appreciate if you like or follow the podcast from wherever you're listening. It'll really help us grow our audience and be able to continue making episodes for you guys. You can also follow us on Instagram for monthly episode schedules, extra content, and even surprise video episodes. All right, I'm done. See you next episode.